Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Radioactive Boy Scout, the frightening true story of a Whiz kid and his homemade nuclear reactor, by Ken Silverstein. Narrated by Jonathan Todd Ross. Prologue. Men in White. The nuclear age comes to Golf Manor. There is hardly a boy or girl alive who is not keenly interested in finding out about things. And that's exactly what chemistry is. Finding out about things. Finding out what things are made of and what changes they undergo. What things? Anything. Everything. The Golden Book of Chemistry Experiments, 1960. Golf Manor is the kind of place where nothing unusual is supposed to happen. The kind of place in which people live precisely because it is more than 25 miles from downtown Detroit, and theoretically away from the poverty, crime, and other complications attendant on that city. It's the kind of place where money buys a bit more land than in the city, perhaps a second bathroom, and so reassures residents that they're safely in the bosom of the middle class. Nestled in a small community called Commerce Township, Golf Manor takes its name from the 18-hole golf course at its entrance. The houses wind along about a dozen streets, lined with trees both old and varied enough to make Golf Manor feel more like a neighborhood than a subdivision. And the few features that do convey subdivision, a sign at the entrance saying, "We have many children, but none to spare. Please drive carefully," have a certain 1950s charm. A typical summer afternoon in Golf Manor brings, under sunny blue skies and a light breeze, the sight of mothers exchanging gossip as they push their newborns in strollers, and the sounds of a few lawnmowers and an occasional whoop from kids jumping on a trampoline or swimming in a backyard pool. In short, it is the kind of place where the only thing lurking around the corner is likely to be a Mr. Softy ice cream truck or a religious devotee peddling the gospel door to door. However, June 26, 1995, would not go down in Golf Manor's collective memory as a typical day. A fact Dottie Peace grasped immediately when she turned onto Pinto Drive. Dottie had risen early for work, and now, with the sun beginning its slow late afternoon descent, wanted nothing more than to pull off her shoes and drop to the living room couch for a rest before dinner. As she neared her home, though, Dottie registered a scene so strange that she might as well have driven straight into an X-Files episode. For what she saw, through a fog of bewilderment and dread, was 11 men swarming across her carefully manicured lawn, 3 of them enveloped in white, ventilated moon suits. The attention of the men seemed to be focused on the backyard of the house next door to hers, specifically on a large wooden potting shed that abutted the chain-link fence between the properties. Thick leafy branches from a tree in Dottie's yard covered the top of the shed, which sat directly in front of a swimming pool that was largely empty save for a small forest of 6-foot weeds growing up through cracks in the bottom. The 3 men in protective suits were dismantling the potting shed with electric saws. Several others were running an industrial-strength vacuum cleaner across the grass and through the swimming pool. The crews were dumping the shed remnants and vacuum debris into large jet-black steel drums, emblazoned with bright yellow signs warning of radioactivity. Dottie parked her car in her driveway and ran to join a group of about 20 Golf Manor denizens who were mustered in front of the house where the men were working. The moods on the block ranged from perplexed and anxious to flat-out panicked. The fear only grew as the chainsaw-wielding cleanup crew, who Dottie learned worked for the Federal Environmental Protection Agency, offered no explanation for its activities beyond vague and empty-sounding assurances that there was nothing for residents to worry about. In lieu of information, Golf Manor residents had only speculation. Unfortunately, they had little to go on. The home that so preoccupied the EPA belonged to a middle-aged couple, Michael Polashek and Patty Hahn, who on weekends were joined by Patty's teenage son David. A polite young man with blonde hair, hazel green eyes, and a freckled face, David didn't seem the sort to cause serious trouble. But he was not in Golf Manor on the day of the EPA's arrival to answer for himself. Michael and Patty, on the other hand, did have a few quirks. For starters, they were drinkers whose arguments had, on occasion, become loud, nasty, and public. Furthermore, Patty, though generally pleasant, had an edgy, hostile streak that could show itself without the slightest warning. Michael seemed less volatile, but he sometimes startled and annoyed neighbors by behaving like an overgrown adolescent. One of his occasional pastimes was relaxing in the backyard with a beer and a small pile of M80s, a powerful firework whose kick is equivalent to a quarter stick of dynamite, which he detonated in the abandoned swimming pool. Still, Dottie had never spotted anything seriously weird at the house next door, at least not weird enough to explain the federal intervention unfolding before her eyes. Now, though, as she huddled with her neighbors and tried to make sense of the situation, Dottie heard one resident who claimed to have woken late on a recent night and seen, from a back window, the potting shed emitting an eerie glow. This pushed Dottie's alarm to new heights, she later recalled. "I went inside and called my husband. I said, 'Dave, there are men in funny suits walking around out here. You've got to do something.'" Bill Larson, a newcomer to the neighborhood, lived just 3 doors down from Michael and Patty. He was in an especially fine mood when he pulled onto Pinto Drive that afternoon, as he had just been visiting his wife and 3-day-old son at the hospital. But as he daydreamed about bringing his newborn home to this cozy nook of a neighborhood, he was suddenly confronted with the EPA spectacle. "Great," he thought. "I've got a new house for my family, and it's sitting in the middle of a toxic dump." For the next 3 days, the EPA crew worked away in Michael and Patty's backyard. They broke down the potting shed until nothing remained in its place but a patch of dirt. They painstakingly vacuumed up every last piece of debris and dust from the work site, and then they loaded the steel drums with the radioactive warning signs onto a flatbed truck, which departed for points unknown. All the while, the workers refused to provide residents, or the handful of TV and newspaper journalists who dropped by after hearing about the story from Dave Peace, with concrete information about their assignment. A mixture of good neighborliness and timidity kept residents from questioning Patty or Michael, who didn't make themselves available for inquiries in any case. During the entire ordeal, Patty emerged just once and very briefly, trying angrily to shoo away onlookers. Otherwise, she and Michael were sequestered in their home, with the phone off the hook. In fact, neither the Peaces, nor the Larsons, nor anyone else in Golf Manor discovered precisely why the EPA had briefly invaded their neighborhood. When asked for details some years later, several residents mumbled something about a small-scale chemical spill. No, others weighed in. The potting shed had sat atop the remains of an industrial waste site created decades earlier. Still others recalled having heard, probably from the few brief stories filed by reporters who were hindered by official stonewalling, that young David Hahn was involved, and that it had had something to do with a small amount of mildly radioactive material. This last group came closest to the truth, but they knew only a small part of the story. If Golf Manorites had been fully informed at the time of the EPA cleanup, their concern and panic might well have given way to full-blown hysteria. For federal authorities had set up camp in their neighborhood because they'd discovered levels of radiation in the potting shed so high as to place the area's 40,000 residents at serious health risk. Calm, placid Pinto Drive had, in fact, been the epicenter of a surreal crisis that had triggered the government's Federal Radiological Emergency Response Plan, the protocol for dealing with any public exposure to radiation be it a small-scale radioactive release from an industrial accident, or a major crisis, such as the near meltdown of the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant in 1979. Indeed, the EPA's precision strike on the potting shed had been planned after consultations with other government agencies, including the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Most bizarre of all, David Hahn had done far more than play around with a few radioactive elements. He had attempted to build a model breeder reactor in his backyard, an effort that grew out of his quest to win an atomic energy merit badge from his local Boy Scout troop. Chapter 1. Roots: The Making of a Teenage Scientist. You, scientist. The Golden Book of Chemistry Experiments, 1960. David Hahn's earliest memory seems appropriate in light of later events. It is of conducting an experiment in the bathroom when he was perhaps 4 years old. With his father at work and his unmindful mother listening to music in the living room of the family's small apartment in suburban Detroit, he rummaged through the medicine chest and under-sink cabinet and gathered toothpaste, soap, medicines, cold cream, nail polish remover, and rubbing alcohol. He mixed everything in a metal bowl and stirred in the contents of an ashtray used by his mother, a chain smoker. I was trying to get a magical reaction, to create something new, he remembered later. I thought that the more things I threw in, the stronger the reaction I'd get. After he finished blending the ingredients together, young David was disappointed to see that all he had in the bowl was a lifeless grayish glob. Hence he went back to the cabinet beneath the sink and pulled out a bright blue bottle, which years later he realized was probably a drain-cleaning product. He uncapped the bottle and poured a healthy amount into the bowl. Soon the mixture began to bubble and threatened to boil over. In a panic, David flushed the contents of the bowl down the toilet. His parents never knew what happened, and David promised himself that he would never again try something so foolish. It was the first of many similar vows made over the years, all broken in short order. It also established a pattern: experiment, trouble, cover up. If David was a slightly odd child, his parents, lost in their own preoccupations, hardly noticed. His father, Ken Hahn, grew up in the Detroit area along with his 4 brothers and sisters. Ken's father was a skilled tradesman, a tool and die maker who worked for General Electric and Pratt & Whitney. At night, Ken would sit with his dad and pore over blueprints of the tools his dad made during his workday. By the time he reached Henry Ford High School, Ken had decided to pursue a similar career, though he was fascinated by the idea of drawing the blueprints, not building the tools. He enrolled in a college prep program for mechanical engineering, and after graduating attended Lawrence Technological University, a local school. Ken was so wrapped up with his engineering studies that he had little time for dating or romance. But while a sophomore at Lawrence Tech, he and a friend were cruising Woodward Avenue just outside of Detroit when they spotted 2 pretty girls driving alongside his Chevy Chevelle. After signaling for them to pull into a big boy hamburger drive-in, Ken zeroed in on 19-year-old Patty Spaulding and came away with her phone number. For Ken, it was love at first sight. She was cute as a bug, he remembered later, proudly showing off a picture of a beautiful young woman with a bouncy smile. But Patty, having recently ended a stormy relationship, was initially aloof. She had not had many positive experiences with men. Patty had been raised in a poor region of West Virginia, and her father had abandoned the family when she was young. Her mother, Lucille, had packed up and moved the family to Detroit, where they had relatives. Lucille found work at a doctor's office, and the family moved into the middle class, albeit at the lower end of that category. It wasn't an easy life, but it was better than West Virginia. Ken was a determined suitor, though. After a 4-year courtship during which he displayed the same tenacity that he normally reserved for work-related engineering challenges, Ken finally wore down Patty's resistance. They were married in July 1974. Like those of all residents of contemporary Detroit, Ken and Patty's lives were shaped physically, economically, and socially by the automobile industry. The metropolitan area was then home to Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, as well as to thousands of small shops that produced machine parts, brake linings, and industrial tools for the big three automakers. Soon after the wedding, Ken found a job as a mechanical engineer at a General Motors subcontractor, and he and Patty moved into a suburban apartment complex not far from his office. David, their only child, was born on October 30th, 1976. Ken worked long hours designing robotic welding machines and other assembly line equipment. He left home punctually at 6 in the morning, rarely returning before 6 in the evening, and sometimes not until after David had gone to bed. Tightly wound, Ken was a dutiful husband and father, but not a demonstrative one. Combined with his constant air of preoccupation, his reserve must have been confounding to a child. Even when Ken was around the house, there was little interaction between father — David remembered him as always off in a fog — and son, who developed an especially close bond with his mother. In contrast to her husband, Patty was outgoing and affectionate. She loved children and painted watercolors of kids at play, some of which were displayed for years at the Detroit Children's Hospital. Patty lacked Ken's focus, though, and had a hard time sticking with anything. She'd dropped out of high school 3 weeks prior to graduation and, despite several attempts, never got around to completing her GED. For a time, she talked about becoming a model and even put together a portfolio before abruptly abandoning the idea. Patty doted on her son and gave him the attention he couldn't get from his anxious and distant father. When David wanted a basketball hoop in his room, Patty made Ken put one up. If David liked a song, she'd play it for him over and over again. As David remembered, "My mom might be sleeping in her room when I got home from elementary school, but she always popped up to see me and we'd do my homework together. If I did a drawing at school, she always put it up on the wall and bragged about how great it was to whoever came over, even the plumber. I thought she was the most wonderful person in the world." But troubles began to dog Patty, though David was largely unaware of what was happening. She developed the drinking problem that ran in her family. A few years after David was born, she began to hear voices and thought strangers were after her. She was diagnosed with depression and paranoid schizophrenia. A variety of antipsychotic medications were prescribed. Fearing someone was trying to kidnap David, Patty took to changing the locks on the doors. She heard ghosts in the apartment building and would take David by the hand, creep down the basement stairs with a flashlight, and make sure nothing was lurking there. Ken hired a retired woman who lived nearby to check up on Patty and his son when he was at work, but by the time David was 4, Patty's condition had deteriorated so badly that she had to be committed to a mental hospital. To explain her absence, Ken told David that his mother had been hurt when her car skidded off the road during a rainstorm. David suspected the story wasn't true. It couldn't have provided much comfort in any case, and felt completely abandoned. Upon hearing that Patty would have to be away for a while, he hid behind the couch in the living room, clasped his knees to his chin, and rocked himself back and forth. Patty returned home 6 months later, and though she wasn't hospitalized again after her release, her illness lingered and deepened. She rarely worked and spent most of her time at the apartment, caring for David when he wasn't at school and watching TV. listening to top 40 hits and playing cards with her girlfriends when he was. Though Patty still pampered David, she became somewhat less attentive. Left on his own, David developed a wild imagination. He built elaborate sets in his room, caves built from pillows and forts constructed in his closet, on which he could act out games with make-believe space explorers and superheroes. He fantasized endlessly about comic book hero Spider-Man, the alias of Peter Parker, a dweebish, bespectacled high school student who gained superpowers after being bitten by a radioactive spider. Meanwhile, the marriage between David's parents was falling apart, riven by financial troubles and Ken's frustration with Patty's failure to look for work, or, in his view, deal with her mental troubles. As David peered out from his bedroom, his parents would scream at each other across the living room, and, on occasion, Patty would hurl a vase or a lamp at the wall. In 1985, when David was 9 years old, his parents finally split, and Patty lost custody of her son. It was then that David's troubles really began. David stayed with his father, who soon began dating a GM engineer named Kathy Missig. Ken and Kathy, whose daughter from a previous marriage, Christina, was David's elder by a year, didn't marry until 6 years later. But within a year of meeting, they bought a house together in Clinton Township, a conservative working-class area about 20 miles north of downtown Detroit. Thanks to Detroit's devotion to the automobile, urban planning and mass transit were, and are, almost unknown to the region. Clinton Township, like other outlying areas, was an endless sprawl of fast-food restaurants, strip malls, shopping centers, and other signposts of suburbia. The Hahn's new home was a small but cozy split-level. The family room boasted birch paneling and a fireplace, while David's bedroom, on the top floor, looked out on a diamond-shaped deck in the backyard, with the requisite affordable luxuries of a barbecue grill, patio furniture, and an above-ground swimming pool. Ken remained wrapped up with his job and was rarely at home, and even more rarely available to his son. He'd often get back long past the dinner hour, so Kathy would leave a plate of food warming for him in the oven. David saw his dad as a hard worker, but conservative and living a boring lifestyle. He talked a lot about work and people I didn't know anything about, he said. He was always telling me that he didn't spend much money, just a few dollars a day. I wanted my life to be more exciting than that. Nor was David close to Kathy, who had the impossible task of replacing David's adored mother. He resented her efforts to impose rules and regulations in his father's absence, and felt that Kathy favored Christina, with whom David had a strained relationship. One Christmas day, David remembered with pain many years later, Christina excitedly opened a number of carefully wrapped presents, while he received only a mad scientist kit containing multicolored goop, something he thought was for babies. For David, growing up was a battle, and he felt that he had to fight for everything, be it affection or money. With the new family, no one paid attention to what I was doing, he said. The caring went away. Weekends and holidays offered a certain relief, as David stayed with his mother and her new boyfriend, Michael Polashek. They lived about 45 minutes away in Commerce Township, which exuded the same comfortable, if slightly less affluent, suburban atmosphere as Clinton Township. An amiable but hard-drinking retired GM forklift operator with a 9th-grade education, Michael looked like he had stepped out of a casting call for Grease. He collected muscle cars like a yellow 1968 Camaro with black racing stripes and a cherry-red 1983 Jaguar, which sat buffed and shined in the driveway. Michael was just as finicky about the house, which he kept spotless even as he fawned over their 5 cats. Michael loved to read, especially books about American history, which made a big impression on David. A further and very different attraction, was his ready supply of cherry bombs and bottle rockets. Michael, Patty, and David often drove out into rural Michigan and hiked along trails that went miles and miles into the wilderness. After pitching a tent and building a campfire, Michael and David would set off a cache of fireworks as Patty flipped burgers on the grill. Life in Commerce Township, though, was far from idyllic, especially given Patty's continual battle with alcoholism and mental decline. While Patty desperately tried to hold herself together when David was around, she suffered violent mood swings and several times disappeared for days. Pictures of Patty from these years bear no resemblance to the sparkling girl in Ken's photograph. In place of the ebullient teenager was a sullen woman, overweight and bloated from drinking. Despite the fact that David was shuffled between eccentric and erratic households, his early years seemed ordinary and happy enough. A short, good-looking kid with an angelic smile, he joined baseball and soccer leagues, explored the neighborhood and woods near his father's home, and spent hours with his friends riding bikes, shooting hoops at the school playground, and playing in a fort that they built out of 2x4s in the branches of an oak tree near a forested trail at the edge of the subdivision. There were, however, some early indications of a quirky personality. David began exhibiting a mildly destructive bent around the age of 5, surely an angry reaction to his mom's hospitalization. He let air out of tires on cars parked in the neighborhood. Once, with a group of friends, he started a fire in the woods that escaped control and required the fire department to put out. David and his buddies fled the scene before the fire trucks arrived, and never told anyone they were responsible for the small blaze. Just a few years later, David became utterly fascinated with everything mechanical. Ken bought him an endless supply of robots, model kits, radios, tape recorders, printers, even simple remote controls. David didn't want the items for their intended purposes, but instead spent hours disassembling and reassembling them to try to figure out how they worked. He didn't want the plastic body, his father remembered. He wanted the guts. David himself says he was intrigued with the idea of using parts from everyday products to make something entirely new. He passed hours dreaming about building a jetpack he could strap to his back and use to fly over the neighborhood, or a robot that could mow the lawn or take out the garbage. David spent a good deal of time with Patty's mom, Lucille, who lived in the town of Berkeley, 4 miles outside the Detroit city limits. Lucille remembered the young David as a hyperactive, skinny kid, surrounded by huge piles of batteries which he'd somehow string together and use as a power source for light bulbs and small appliances. "He spent a lot of time trying to build things," said Lucille, a short woman whose height was extended by a bouffant hairdo. "He didn't play outside as much as most kids do." David's budding scientific persona bloomed especially brightly in Golf Manor, largely because he had little responsible adult supervision. Like many young boys, David soon discovered the existential pleasures in blowing things up, a pursuit to which he devoted considerable time and energy. He perfected a recipe for homemade gunpowder and manufactured small bombs, which he and Michael, his partner in demolition, detonated in the woods at the bottom of their empty swimming pool and anywhere else that the urge struck. "We went out to the boondocks and blew those things up." Michael, who even as a middle-aged man loved a big boom, recalled with a laugh and an admiring shake of his head. "He scared the hell out of me." At first glance, David's behavior might not appear terribly different from the mix of adventurousness, curiosity, and mischief displayed by plenty of young boys. In fact, until the age of 10, David's scientific fantasies and explosives workshop were merely distractions. Sports, skateboarding, and exploring the woods with his friends were the focus of his life. The first sign that a hobby was becoming a mania came when John Sims, Kathy's father, gave him a used, long out-of-print copy of The Golden...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?